It's week 10 of the college football season, and I'm joined by Dan and Ty from the Solid Verbal. We're going to be talking about conference championship games, the college football playoff, Heisman Trophy, and who's the worst texter among Big Ten coaches. As we look ahead to the college football playoff and teams are trying to build strong playoff resumes, what's a trap game for a highly ranked team that you're eager for?
I'll go first. Miami. Miami's got two that are still on the schedule right now. They've got one coming up against Georgia Tech next week on the road. They close out the season on the road against Syracuse. I happen to think Miami's one of the best teams in the country. I picked them to win the ACC way back in August. I still think they've got obviously what it takes from a talent standpoint to do that. But this is a team that we have also seen sometimes play down to its competition, inexplicably so. It happened for 3 straight weeks just a couple weeks ago. So I don't think we can view Miami as bulletproof at this point in time. And some of these schools they've got coming up, especially on the road, they strike me as interesting matchups, not necessarily guaranteed losses. But if Miami is not fully focused, could be a little bit of drama, let's say, that we don't necessarily see coming now in week 10.
I have one for this week specifically, and that is Texas A&M on the road at South Carolina. And I don't know how much of a trap it is because we know South Carolina's good, took Alabama to the gun, but you combine South Carolina's pass rush with the playmaker at quarterback, with Texas A&M and maybe a little bit of a letdown spot after that LSU win, going on the road, Williams-Brice, Columbia, South Carolina at night. Again, that pass rush keeps me up at night. I don't have to face them. I just think about them sometimes, and I get scared under the covers. So what is Texas A&M going to do if it's Marcel Reed? And while he's really, really good, still a little bit raw, still a little bit green, still a little bit inexperienced, how does he handle that road spot? Does he look like what he looked like at Florida? It's a different animal defensively at South Carolina. I'd be a little bit scared right now if I were the Aggies, who are very good. That's just a tough spot.
For my trap game for a highly ranked team, I'm actually looking at two, and mostly because I couldn't decide, but I'm looking at Oregon. And I want to preface this with, obviously, Oregon has been the most dominant and complete team all season. So it shouldn't really have an issue with trap games, but that's why they're called trap games. But I look at Oregon, and Oregon hasn't had to travel too much this season. So I'm looking at Oregon at Michigan this weekend and Oregon at Wisconsin in week 12. Because so far Oregon's traveled to Oregon State and UCLA and Purdue. And we've seen multiple Big Ten teams have issues when they have to travel across at least 2 time zones. But I think there's a chance that Oregon could see some challenges that it hasn't really seen before because aside from the defenses of these two teams, Camp Randall is a rowdy stadium to play in. The Big House is a rowdy stadium to play in. And these two teams should get demolished. But when you factor in the travel and the home field advantages, I think the Ducks might, at least maybe in the first half of these games, see some challenges that they're not used to.
I don't hate that pick. Obviously, I think the Michigan one actually a little bit scarier, even though the Michigan offense hasn't been good this year. They're the offense between Michigan and Wisconsin playing at home that I think has a little bit more pop potential because of the running backs, because of Colston Loveland. These are legitimate weapons, even though the offensive line for Michigan isn't where it was last year and the defense was where it last year. Michigan's in a weird emotional place where they're just sort of backed up against the wall and have nothing to lose. And this game will go into the night a little bit. The Big House is looking for something after the Michigan State win to keep the good vibes going. Maybe there's a little bit more confidence in Ann Arbor after that win last week. Wisconsin doesn't scare me as an Oregon human as much just because weaponry wise on offense, there's not nearly as much to, you got to score probably around 30 points to beat Oregon. I don't know if Michigan can score 30 points. I'm actually pretty sure they can't score 30 points. But in terms of ugling up this game and slowing it down, maybe trying to control clock, I think Michigan has at least that ability to a greater extent than Wisconsin.
It's the first year of a 12-team college football playoff. What do you think would make this playoff expansion a success in its first year?
Oh, I think it's incredible games on campus. Because if we have incredible games on campus that first weekend, week, whatever, the mid-December, late December, the December 19th, 20th area, it's going to generate buzz, right? There's nothing like a great game deep into the season that is going to get and keep people excited for the playoffs. So whether it is Penn State hosting a game, whether it is Miami hosting a game, whether it's Texas hosting a game, there's going to be something new and novel about having a December game on campus. Maybe that goes to overtime. Maybe that gets us a matchup we've never seen or rarely seen. That I think would, for me, because I think we're going to end up seeing a lot of the familiar teams later on in the playoff. But if we can get that early, that's almost a justification for the move.
Yeah, I think two things, if I could zoom out for a second, that would at least make it a
Do it,
success
Ty.
for me. The first is, if we make it through the full regular season without it feeling like things got watered down, that would be a huge plus, because that was the argument against this system. Oh, they're going to add the playoff. Oh, losses aren't going to have the same weight that they did before. People won't watch. I have not detected that thus far. And maybe it's because it's a weird year in college football and we don't have any obvious powerhouses this season. But
excuse me.
Well, besides your Oregon Ducks.
Thank you very much.
Otherwise, it feels to me like we have not gotten to that point yet where people are saying, yeah, this feels watered down. We don't like the product. So if we make it the full way through, that would be a plus. And I guess to your point, Dan, just this air of unpredictability, if we have that with the playoff, that would in and of itself be a success, because part of the vibes we have picked up from our listeners over the years, why they don't like the playoff as much, why they hate talking about the playoff, is because it feels like it is the same teams. It feels like, oh, it's going to be Alabama, or it's going to be Georgia, or it's going to be Clemson or Ohio State. These teams are going to get in it. They're going to win it. We know what's going to happen before it even starts. I don't think we're headed there this year, not just because there are more teams, but again, because it is kind of a weird year. But if we can get to that point where it doesn't feel like this is preordained and there is a real legit reason to watch the first round on campus, certainly from a media standpoint, the semifinals, right? If it gets to the point later in the tournament where there is still intrigue and interest in watching this thing, I think we're gonna have to see as we go along whether or not that interest persists. But I think it'll be there to start, and I'm hopeful that it'll be there at the very end. Just that general sense, kind of like you get with the NCAA tournament, where you're intrigued by the teams that are in it. You're not necessarily sure who's going to win. That would be a success in my eyes.
By the way, people are scared of change sometimes. People are scared of the new. People are scared of this kind of stuff. So maybe something familiar would be helpful in making this a success. So if, let's say, Notre Dame loses its first game 35-3, it's something we can all relate to, right? It's something that, as we look back over the history of modern college football, you're like, yeah, there's so much changing here and realignment and loss of rivalries, but like, there's something nice about being able to sort of sink your teeth into Notre Dame again, losing immediately, right?
I just leave that one with you, man. You can say whatever you want. It's fine.
No, that's true. And honestly, that sets me up perfectly. That's kind of what I was thinking would make it a success is, we do have those staples. And I think an expanded college football playoff actually helps the haves more than the have-nots. And we will see the usual suspects back in the playoff. But I think another indicator of what would make it a success is if one of those lower ranked playoff teams or a group of 5 team makes it to the semifinals and sees success there, whether it's, Boise State or Indiana or BYU or someone who's never been in the conversation really in the 4-team playoff. I think that if, we look back at past years of teams, whether, like Cincinnati, who actually made it in, or we go all the way back and look at like UCF, who definitely felt like they should have made it in 2017. I think that would make it a success, is if we see some of these lower ranked playoff teams who are not typically in the playoff conversation making it past the first round.
Well, you need the Cinderella, right? You need like every good tournament has the Cinderella. You need the Cinderella that everybody else can root for if their team isn't in it. That gives them a reason to watch, gives them someone to rally behind. I agree. I would go a step further. It'd be nice to have that, presumably not having that team upset one of ours, right, for personal purposes. But beyond that, just to not have blowouts, right? To not have blowouts like we have seen all too often in the 4-team era. If these games are close, to Dan, your point, if we've got close games on campus, I think that just stirs up the interest in this all the more.
Absolutely. And that brings us to, for the college football playoff, who would be a Cinderella team? And I think, Cinderella, when you define it in terms of college football versus March Madness, is a little bit different because obviously the postseason setup is different. But I think a Cinderella team here would be anyone who typically doesn't make the playoff or who historically has not been in that 4-team conversation. So who would you pick as a potential Cinderella team for the playoff this year with 12 teams?
I think Indiana checks every box. I think Indiana, and Ty has talked about this on our show, that they have the opportunity to even go undefeated, not make the Big Ten championship game, which is probably great for them, give them an extra week off, host a game on campus. And I don't think anybody has a ton, other than Purdue fans, of negative feelings about Indiana. We look at Kurt Signetti coming in from a smaller school and immediately turning the Hoosiers into a war machine that, they haven't played a really strong team yet, but it's probably the most likable story of the season. Again, if you're not a Purdue fan.
Yeah, Indiana checks the boxes. BYU checks a lot of the boxes. We talked about them before, but BYU coming into this season, huge questions, not just about the schedule, but about quarterback. And they have really exceeded expectations on that front. A few other ones I throw out, SMU. SMU ain't dead yet. They lost to BYU, but they've got a good schedule the rest of the way. They got a big one coming up this weekend against Pitt that I think they have a real claim to a path, let's say, to get into that ACC title game if things break their way. I'd throw them in that mix as well. I'd also throw Colorado a bit in the mix. I don't know if they classify
That's what I was looking for.
Yeah, I don't know if they're like a Cinderella at this point. Certainly they have not played for a whole lot lately.
An outsider, yeah.
So in that sense,
a playoff outsider.
They're definitely there. They are kind of a media darling of sorts because Colorado's ever in the news. But right now they're at like 6-1 to make the playoff. They would need some help. They would need Iowa State to lose. They would need a couple things need to go their way, but the schedule sets up in such manner that you could definitely squint and see them going 10-2, finding their way into that Big 12 championship game against perhaps a BYU. If they could pull an upset, there's a real chance that Colorado could find their way into this thing with a first-round bye.
Army is looking like it could be an outside college football playoff contender. If it has a strong playoff resume, do you think the college football committee would actually consider them as a legitimate playoff team?
I think so. We've been looking at this a lot lately because we happen to think there is a lot of intrigue over which G5 team gets into the playoff, because it's the one part of this new system that's a lot like old systems where all the media folks and all the voters and all the committee members are going to get together in a room and they're going to pick their favorite. There's a little bit of a beauty pageant element to this. And from where we stand, it looks like it's going to be the winner of the Mountain West, the winner of the American. Well, Boise State's already got a loss, a close one against Oregon. And there's a chance they're going to play UNLV again in the Mountain West championship game. And the first time they played, like last week, it was real close. There's a chance they could drop that game. Army, meanwhile, has a glide path into the American championship game, whether that's against Navy, whether it's against Tulane. But they're playing legitimately very, very good football, and Dan's got a lot of the stats to back this up. They have improved dramatically on both sides of the football. So I think it stands to reason that if we know it's in all likelihood going to be a team from the Mountain West or the American, and the team from the Mountain West, if Boise were to drop one, it's just there for Army. I think the committee would have no choice but to take them seriously. It'd be a great story. I'm kind of rooting for it, to be honest with you. But I think they would have to be taken seriously, Dan. I don't know.
Yeah, Army, given their schedule with Tulane and Notre Dame. And look, we already have a history of a G5 team using Notre Dame, and this is not me making fun of the Irish, let's be clear, but using that as a signature win and proof of concept that they can not only hang with, but beat some of the better teams in the sport, regardless of conference affiliation or regardless of school size. And so if Army's able to do that, you're talking about a team that on their resume, they would finish strong with Tulane. I don't know where that game is in the moment, Ty. You can look it up and fact check for me. But they have Notre Dame away from home, and they would have a quality Navy team. Potentially, who knows who they would play. I mean, obviously this game, the playoff would be decided before the official Army-Navy game, but they could end up playing Navy in the American Championship game. So I think the resume would be strong, especially if we're talking about a Boise team with a second loss. It'd be near impossible to keep Army out at that point.
But if Boise State ends up as the highest ranked Group of 5 team, I think Army's schedule, whether or not it beats Notre Dame, is what is going to hold it back at this point. Because if it goes 1-11, I could see the committee looking at their strength of schedule right now is 23rd or 133rd, and their strength of record is 23rd right now. You can't help your schedule. You're dealt who you're dealt, but I think Army absolutely needs to beat Notre Dame, or it's probably not going to be in this conversation.
Mandatory, yes.
Yeah, I mean, I think Army can get away without beating Notre Dame.
Really?
I do. Because they go 11-1. They go 11-1, they win their conference, and
so 12-1 at that point. Yeah.
12-1, right? They win the conference. It stands to reason that, again, if Boise drops a game, if Boise wins out, Boise's in. They're not going to keep Boise out at this point with a close loss against Oregon. There's no way.
And a Heisman caliber.
And a Heisman caliber might break Barry Sanders' record. Like, they're not going to leave Ashton Ginty out of this. He's the biggest star in the G5 right now. But we could come to a circumstance where Army's one loss is against a top 10 Notre Dame team, where they're by default going to end up being the American champion over, maybe a Navy team that also has a loss to Notre Dame. That's a possibility. I just think that you can't really count them out at this point, even if they end up with that one loss. There's whoever makes it from the G5 is going to have a loss at this point.
You probably can't lose that game 51-13 though, right?
You can't lose it 51-13.
Yeah,
if you're Army.
it can't be a blowout.
If that's a 28-21 game, you're like, all right, they gave Notre Dame most of what it could handle. Great.
Dan and Ty, thank you so much for joining us on Before the Snap. Where should fans go to find more information about the Solid Verbal?
You could go on out to our website, solidverbal.com. We are first and foremost a podcast, the most well-known, the biggest independent college football podcast out there. You can look for the Solid Verbal wherever you get your podcasts. You can find us out on YouTube. Really, wherever you are on the internet, just search for the Solid Verbal and you'll find us.
Hey, sports fans, if you want to see more videos like this, check out some of our other ones right here. And if you like what you see, make sure to hit the subscribe button and stay tuned for more from USA Today Sports.